something extraordinary is happening on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine. The war that Vladimir Putin launched with supreme confidence, the war he expected to be over in days, perhaps weeks, has now turned against him so decisively that even the Kremlin's own state-run polling agencies can no longer hide the truth from the Russian people. Russia is not winning. Russia is not stalling. In the early months of 2026, Russia is slipping into what may be one of the most humiliating strategic failures of the modern era. The front lines have essentially frozen. The casualty rate has hit record highs. Recruitment is falling short of what is needed to sustain the fight. The armor that once made Russian ground power so feared is burning in Ukrainian fields. And in Moscow itself, the mood is shifting in ways that no amount of propaganda can fully suppress. To understand how we arrived here, we need to go back to where it all began. When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine in February 2022, the opening weeks of the invasion appeared to go largely as Putin had planned. Columns of armor surged across the border from the north, east, and south simultaneously. Ukrainian cities and towns began to fall. Russian forces drew frighteningly close to Kyiv itself, close enough that the world held its breath, and many Western analysts quietly predicted the capital would be encircled within days. At the height of that initial push, in late March 2022, Russian forces had seized or occupied roughly a quarter of Ukraine's entire territory. The champagne was probably already on ice in the Kremlin. It appeared to be only a matter of time. But something had gone badly wrong beneath the surface of those early advances. The Russian military had been built and marketed as a modern, reformed force, a fearsome successor to Soviet power. What the opening weeks of the invasion revealed instead was a deeply dysfunctional institution, plagued by poor logistics, catastrophic command failures, a complete underestimation of Ukrainian resistance, an armor that moved in predictable columns straight into devastating ambushes. The advance peaked and then stalled. The Russians were forced to withdraw from the north entirely, including their push toward Kyiv. And in the counteroffensives that followed, Ukraine, increasingly equipped with Western weapons and intelligence, tore back thousands of square miles of territory. By the end of 2022, Russia's control of Ukrainian land had fallen from roughly a quarter of the country to around 18%. It has spent the years since then trying, and largely failing, to claw back what it lost. That trajectory, an initial surge followed by grinding, expensive, sluggish progress, has defined the war ever since. And in 2026, it has entered a new and deeply alarming phase for Moscow, because even that grinding progress has now effectively stopped. Military analysts monitoring the conflict closely have noted that Russia's frontline forces have hit a near-total standstill. Their territorial gains in the first quarter of this year are so small they are almost not worth measuring. In fact, to quantify Russia's land capture across the entire first 3 months of 2026, analysts reached for a memorable comparison. The total area Russia gained in that period is roughly equivalent to the footprint of a medium-sized American city. That is the sum achievement of what is, on paper, one of the largest military forces on the planet, after a full quarter year of offensive operations. The data supporting that picture is precise and well documented. The Institute for the Study of War, one of the most respected conflict tracking organizations in the world, found that Russian advances slowed dramatically through the latter stages of 2025 and dropped sharply as 2026 began. Russian forces advanced at an average of 5.5 square kilometers per day in the first 3 months of this year, compared to more than 11 square kilometers per day during the same period in 2025. The year-on-year deterioration is stark. Breaking it down month by month, January saw Russia capture around 319 square kilometers, a modest number for an army that was supposed to be on the offensive, but still the highest point of the quarter. February brought a dramatic drop. Russian gains fell to just over 123 square kilometers, the smallest monthly advance recorded since April of 2024. But February carried an even more significant number buried inside those totals. For the first time since 2023, Ukrainian forces actually liberated more territory than Russian forces seized. The last time that had happened, Ukraine was deep in its major counteroffensive operations. Conflict analysts describe the February reversal as a meaningful turning point, a sign that the momentum on the ground was not simply slowing for Russia, but actively shifting in Ukraine's direction. March was worse still. Russian forces recorded almost no territorial gains whatsoever, their most anemic monthly performance in more than 2.5 years. Over the entire month, they seized a total of approximately 23 square kilometers, while simultaneously ceding ground in other sectors. In net terms, Russia's army was barely moving, and in some places was moving backward. That picture is consistent across the broader data. Studies of specific campaigns tell the same story in microscopic detail. In one of Russia's most prolonged and heavily resourced offensives, the grinding push toward the city of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region, forces covered just 50 kilometers over the course of approximately 2 years. That works out to an average advance of around 70 meters per day, a walking pace. Slower, in fact, than the pace at which Allied troops advanced during one of the most costly and grueling battles of the First World War over a century ago. Similar campaigns in other directions, toward Kupiansk, toward Chasiv Yar, have been even slower. The Russian military machine in 2026 has been reduced to fighting for craters and fields, taking months to capture settlements that amount to a handful of damaged buildings. At that pace, the 4 eastern regions Putin originally designated as his primary objectives would take years more to fully capture. Each additional year is a year of economic drain, international isolation, and deepening damage to Putin's historical legacy. And yet the territorial stagnation, alarming as it is, may not be the most dangerous number in this war for Moscow. Because at the same moment that Russian forces are barely moving, they are dying and being wounded at historically unprecedented rates. March 2026 was the single deadliest month for Russian forces since the full-scale invasion began. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, citing confirmed, video-documented losses, reported that more than 35,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded in March alone. That figure, which Ukrainian defense officials say is conservatively verified, backed by drone footage of individual strikes, represented a 29% increase over the February total. It was also higher than the previous record, set in December 2025. Across the full first quarter of 2026, Russian casualties exceeded 90,000, approaching 100,000 men killed or wounded in 3 months. To put that in human terms, Russia is losing roughly 1,000 soldiers every single day. That is 2 full military battalions, wiped out every 24 hours, in a war whose front lines have barely moved in months. No army in the world can sustain that indefinitely, not even one belonging to a country of Russia's size. The brutal arithmetic of attrition is beginning to assert itself, and for the first time, credible reporting suggests that Russia is losing troops faster than it can replace them. Western officials have assessed that Russia is suffering approximately 40,000 casualties per month, while recruiting only around 30 to 35,000 new soldiers during the same period. If that gap holds, Russia's overall force inside Ukraine begins to shrink. And those figures don't account for quality, only quantity. The recruitment crisis has forced the Kremlin into increasingly desperate measures. Russia has turned to Africa for mercenaries. It has brought in soldiers from North Korea. It has emptied significant portions of its prison population, sending convicted criminals, including those serving time for serious violent offenses, directly to the front lines. It has leaned on people with chronic illnesses, people who were pressured or effectively coerced into signing contracts, and people motivated not by patriotism, but by the substantial financial bonuses offered to volunteers and their families. Universities have been pressured to encourage students to enlist. Businesses have been pressed to nudge employees toward military service. Even with all of that, Russia is falling short of its recruitment targets for the year. And with Ukraine now stating its goal is to eliminate more than 50,000 Russian personnel per month through expanded drone and artillery campaigns, there is no realistic scenario in which Moscow can keep its ranks adequately replenished through volunteer recruitment alone. The manpower deficit is becoming a strategic vulnerability, one that Ukraine's military commanders openly say they are working to exploit. The casualty numbers interact with another profound problem: the near-total destruction of Russia's operational armor. Over 4 years of war, Russia has lost an extraordinary number of tanks. Ukrainian military reporting and independent open-source analysis place the total number of destroyed, captured, or abandoned Russian tanks in the thousands, making this conflict the most destructive for armored vehicles of any war in the post-World War II era. Russia's pre-war tank fleet has been severely depleted. Modern tanks from its operational inventory are largely gone. The factories producing replacements cannot keep up, and so Russia has turned increasingly to its Soviet-era storage reserves, pulling aging platforms, including the T-62 main battle tank, out of warehouses and sending them to the front. The T-62 entered service in the early 1960s. It is a machine whose introduction was monitored by Cold War leaders of a generation long since gone. Sending it to fight in a 21st-century battlefield dominated by precision drones and anti-armor systems is less a military strategy than a testament to how far Russia's armored capability has been degraded. Without adequate armor, Russia's infantry tactics have become the dominant operational model, and those tactics are brutal and deeply inefficient. Small groups of soldiers, sometimes 15 to 20 men, are pushed forward into contested kill zones. Ukrainian drone operators, artillery, and snipers pick them apart methodically. These are not coordinated combined arms operations. They are human wave assaults with minimal fire support and limited armor protection. That is what Russia's offensive capability has been reduced to in 2026. Compounding all of this is the fundamental change in the quality of the troops Russia is fielding. In the early months of the invasion, the Russian military consisted largely of career soldiers, men who had trained for years, who had combat experience, who understood the systems they were operating, and who were psychologically prepared for the demands of the battlefield. Those men have been systematically killed and wounded over 4 years of attritional war. The soldiers who replace them are, in many cases, the opposite in almost every respect. They are drawn from the categories already described: convicts, economically vulnerable volunteers, pressured conscripts, the sick, the old. They arrive at the front with weeks of rudimentary training, if that. Multiple documented incidents show newly arrived Russian troops making elementary errors that experienced soldiers would never make, grouping together in exposed positions, wandering off in unfamiliar terrain, failing to take basic cover when drone sounds are heard. This is not a professional army fighting below its potential. In many frontline sectors, it is a barely trained levy of reluctant fighters being fed into a war they do not understand and do not want. The psychological consequence of all of this is a collapse in morale that is becoming one of Russia's most serious operational liabilities. Morale in a prolonged conflict is not just a soft factor. It is the engine that sustains offensive operations, keeps soldiers at their positions under fire, and generates the collective willpower that keeps an army cohesive under stress. When morale collapses, when soldiers are calculating their own survival rather than the mission's success, fighting power degrades rapidly, and no amount of top-down pressure from commanders can substitute for the will to fight. Russia's army in 2026 is showing clear signs of exactly that collapse. Desertion rates are climbing. More soldiers are surrendering rather than fighting. The culture of the front lines has shifted from one of offensive purpose to one of endurance and avoidance. The effects of the war are no longer confined to the battlefield. Inside Russia itself, the weight of the conflict is now felt in daily life in ways that were not true in the early years of the invasion. Dozens of Russian regions are under severe fiscal stress, driven in large part by the enormous costs of recruitment bonuses, death payments to families, and one-time sign-up incentives that regional governments are now obligated to fund. Officials who should be managing healthcare, education, and infrastructure are instead spending their budgets and their time trying to persuade reluctant men to sign military contracts. Public services are deteriorating. Food and energy prices are rising. Families are losing sons, husbands, and brothers at an ever-accelerating rate. That accumulating domestic pressure is showing up in the one place where it is hardest for the Kremlin to hide it: in polling. Russia's state pollster, not an independent source, not a Western think tank, but the Kremlin's own survey organization, reported that Putin's approval rating fell for 7 consecutive weeks through April 2026, dropping to its lowest level since before the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. His official rating has slipped to around 65 to 66%, down more than 10 points from where it stood at the end of 2025. An independent open question survey, where respondents name politicians they trust without prompting, showed an even steeper drop, with Putin's trust rating falling below 30%, a figure that would have been unthinkable during the patriotic surge of 2022. Approval ratings for the Russian government, the State Duma, and the Federation Council have all simultaneously hit lows not seen since the invasion began. And independent Russian polling, conducted by organizations not beholden to the state, shows that a clear majority of Russians want the war brought to an end. When even a state-controlled polling apparatus is releasing numbers showing a leader's sustained and accelerating decline, it is a sign that the discontent has grown too large to manage with selective data. Looking forward, the situation does not obviously improve for Moscow. Russia is expected to attempt another large-scale offensive during the summer months, a period when better weather and firmer ground traditionally favor offensive operations. But the preconditions for a successful summer offensive are not in place. Russia does not have the armor reserves it had in previous years. It cannot assemble and train offensive groupings at the scale the operation would require without exposing other sectors of the front. And Ukraine is not the exhausted, under-equipped force it was in some earlier stages of the war. Ukraine is, in fact, growing more capable in specific and strategically important ways. Its drone production has expanded dramatically. In March 2026, Ukraine carried out more drone strikes than Russia for the first time in the war's history. Ukrainian interceptor drones shot down record numbers of Russian unmanned systems in the same month. Long-range strike capabilities are increasing, and crucially, Ukrainian forces are now inflicting casualties at a rate that is beginning to threaten the Russian military's ability to sustain offensive operations. Ukraine's military commander has stated that Ukrainian forces have seized the strategic initiative, not because they are advancing rapidly, but because they are denying Russia the ability to mount large-scale offensives. Experienced military observers note that Ukrainian forces have demonstrated the ability to execute major reversals when conditions allow, driving Russian forces back across the Dnipro River in the south, clearing them from significant stretches of territory in the north and east. The brittleness of Russia's command structure, the corruption endemic to its officer corps, the shortage of capable frontline leaders, and the reliance on untrained infantry rather than combined arms maneuver have all created vulnerabilities that Ukraine has exploited before and can exploit again. There is also a larger strategic picture that haunts Moscow's planners. With an estimated 97% of Russia's entire military capacity committed inside Ukraine, the country has effectively left itself exposed everywhere else. Russia is not in a position to respond meaningfully to any secondary threat. Its military reserves have been consumed. Its production has been strained. Its trained manpower has been killed and wounded at a pace that will take years to recover from, even after the war eventually ends. The broader implications of that exposure, for Russia's standing in its own region, for its relationships with neighbors, for its ability to project power anywhere beyond Ukraine, are significant and long-lasting. Putin launched this war believing he was projecting strength. What 4 years of conflict have revealed instead is a military whose capabilities were overstated, an economy whose resilience has been overestimated, and a society whose tolerance for sacrifice has limits. The front lines of 2026 tell the story plainly. An army barely moving, bleeding at record pace, fielding tanks that belong in museums, led by officers steeped in corruption, and filled with soldiers who, in many cases, would rather be anywhere else on Earth. That is not the picture of a war Russia is winning. It is the picture of a war Russia is struggling, at great cost, simply not to lose.